There's a saying that if you get injured on a table saw, it's the operator's fault. But if you get injured on a radial arm saw, it's the machine's fault. Many modern woodworkers are quick to claim that radial arm saws are extremely dangerous, especially when it comes to ripping. It's a comment repeated over and over on many internet forums, but few provide a good reason why. How did the radial arm saw get this bad reputation for ripping, and is it true? In this video, I'll try to answer these questions. First, a little background and history. If you look at the cross-section of a log, you will see the annual growth rings that formed as the tree grew. When we cut boards from a log, the growth rings are revealed as parallel lines along the face of the board. The direction of these parallel lines define the grain of the wood, as you can clearly see in this board. As opposed to cross-cutting, where logs or boards are cut across the grain of the wood, ripping is the process of cutting with or along the grain. In older times, logs were ripped into lumber by hand using straight-bladed whip saws. The log was usually positioned over a pit to accommodate a two-person saw. Hence, these were also known as pit saws. Prior to electricity, saws were powered by wind, water, and steam. In some cases, these power sources turned line shafts from which multiple tools could be connected by belts. Here's an example of my local water-powered up-and-down sawmill ripping lumber from a log. Around 1810, many sawmills began switching from straight-bladed saws to round saw blades. In the U.S., this is often credited to the Shaker, Tabitha Babbitt. Small, individual, electrically powered saws came to prominence in the 1920s after towns became electrified near the turn of the century. These included 3 power tools that could be used to rip lumber, namely the bandsaw, the table saw, and the radial arm saw. This now enabled saws to be used in small or home wood shops where they previously needed to reside directly at the sources that powered them. What exactly are the dangers when ripping lumber with a power saw? There are 2 general safety concerns. The first is injury caused by direct contact of the body with the cutting blade, usually to the hand or fingers. In the second case, energy imparted from the spinning blade can propel the workpiece, sometimes violently, back towards the operator. This is generally referred to as kickback. Either case can result in life-changing injuries. Let's take a look at how these can occur and how the risk of injury can be minimized. The radial arm saw is an interesting machine that includes many degrees of freedom in its operation, from leveling the table, changing the height, rotating the arm, moving the carriage, tilting the yoke, or rotating the blade. There is no doubt that the radial arm saw is a complicated tool to set up and properly align. I have a separate video that describes this process, and I'll include a link to that and other related videos in the description below. However, having a properly set up and aligned machine is the first step necessary to safely operate a radial arm saw. It's difficult discussing ripping on a radial arm saw without comparing it to its more popular rival, the table saw. The blade on a table saw rotates against the feed direction of the wood. When the wood first enters the blade, the rotational force is directed down towards the table. However, as the wood reaches the far end of the blade, the rotational force may tend to lift the wood up. For this reason, the operator needs to help hold the wood down as it's pushed past the blade. Even with a push block, you must physically reach over and extend beyond the blade to complete a rip cut on the table saw. Unfortunately, most table saw users do not use their blade guards, and physical proximity to the blade always increases the risk of injury. If the board moves away from the fence and into the back of the blade, the board can be violently thrown and possibly pull the hand into the blade. Another form of kickback occurs when the rotational force of the blade causes the board or the cutoff between the fence and blade to be thrown directly back towards the operator. Today, the addition of riving knives, better design of push blocks, and the introduction of active injury mitigation technology have helped make table saws safer. The geometry of a radial arm saw is different than a table saw, in that the motor and blade are located above the table instead of below. Like the table saw, the blade rotates against the feed direction of the wood. However, in this case, the rotational force of the blade is directed up as the wood first enters the blade. For this reason, the blade guard is lowered to prevent the board from lifting. As the wood reaches the far end of the blade, the rotational force is now directed down towards the table. Therefore, unlike the table saw, there is absolutely no reason to hold the wood down as it's pushed past the blade. Instead, a push board is used to safely push both the board and cutoff completely past the blade. Therefore, the risk of direct physical contact with the blade is less when ripping on a radial arm saw. The greatest risk of injury whilst ripping on a radial arm saw is kickback, where the wood is ejected straight back along the fence. For this reason, the saw includes an anti-kickback pawl that prevents the board and cutoff from being ejected. If set too low, the anti-kickback pawl will not grab the wood. To be effective, the pawl must be set at the correct height. Check for proper height by verifying you cannot pull the wood backwards. Another useful anti-kickback device that you may want to consider are board buddies. These are one-directional wheels designed to both keep the wood tight against the fence and to prevent kickback. When ripping, actually for any operation, a sharp blade is critical to easily cut through the wood. Otherwise, the teeth may grab the wood, stall the motor, or kick back the board. In the early days of the radial arm saw, aggressive low tooth count steel blades were the norm. These blades would dull much faster than today's carbide tip blades. This is one of the reasons DeWalt included a reminder on the saw to keep your blades sharpened. Blade choice is one of the most important considerations to safely use your radial arm saw. There are only 2 blades I will use on my saws. The first is the TCG, or Triple Chip Grind, version of the Forrest Woodworker 1. This blade was co-developed by Wally Kunkel and Forrest, specifically for the radial arm saw. This particular blade can only be custom ordered directly through Forrest. Otherwise, there's only one distributor that I'm aware of where you can buy it direct, and that's Slivers Mill, and I'll leave a link to that in my video description. The other blade that I use is the Freud LU83. I actually prefer this blade for ripping since it includes larger gullets to remove the wood waste. However, both of these blades work very well in all configurations: crosscut, miter, bevel, and ripping. I would never suggest using a dedicated rip blade on a radial arm saw, since the lower tooth count is more susceptible to kickback if a tooth ever grabbed the wood. Did you know that it can take 2 to 3 times more power to comfortably rip compared to cross-cutting the same board? For this reason, we want to reduce the cutting load on the motor as much as possible. Both of the blades I recommended are thin kerf blades, which means they are thinner and remove less wood than the standard width blades. The Freud LU83 is the thin kerf version of their LU84 blade. As shown in this calculation, the thin kerf blade removes about 28% less wood, and that translates to more power available to rip. Besides using a thin kerf blade, there's another trick that few people take advantage of to reduce the cutting load on the motor, and that's by reducing the blade diameter. The theoretical electric torque for my 1.5 horsepower 3,425 RPM motor is calculated to be 27.6 pound-force inches. The force that the tooth can exert on the wood depends on the distance from the central axis. If we calculate that force for different blade diameters, you see that the cutting force increases as the blade diameter decreases. For example, if the cut capacity allows, you can increase the cutting force about 20% if you change your 10-inch blade to an 8-inch blade. The trade-off is that the rim speed of the blade will decrease by the same amount. Therefore, you gain 20% in cutting force, but you'll need to feed the wood about 20% slower. Nevertheless, a small diameter blade will more easily rip and better perform, especially if you have a small saw with a low horsepower motor. One unique feature of the radial arm saw is the ability to make and use custom fences. For example, a European style fence that does not extend past the center axis of the blade. This is particularly useful when ripping reaction wood that may open up during the cut. This allows the wood to expand instead of being trapped against the fence and pressing against the blade. Another example is an extra long rip fence used to help align and control long pieces of lumber or sheet goods cut in the rip mode. There are definitely more steps and considerations required to safely rip on a radial arm saw. As previously highlighted, they include properly setting up and aligning the saw, adjusting the blade guard to prevent lifting, using the anti-kickback paw, using a proper push board, choosing an appropriate blade, and never standing directly behind the board. So how did the radial arm saw get a bad reputation for ripping? One example can be found in Wally Kunkel's book, How to Master the Radial Arm Saw, where he recounts a tragic story that occurred in the 1950s and reported in the New York Daily News. A man was cutting 2-inch strips from an 8-foot-long piece of plywood in the rip mode. The anti-kickback pawl was missing. When the cut was complete, the strip ejected, and his young son, who was standing behind the board, was killed. Obviously, this terrible accident was completely preventable had the anti-kickback pawl been used, and his young son was not standing behind the table. Similar accidents and deaths have occurred with table saws. In my opinion, it's just easier to blame accidents or injuries on the machine rather than take personal responsibility for their improper use. So, is it true that ripping on a radial arm saw is dangerous? The fact is, ripping on any power saw is inherently dangerous. However, as long as the blade guard is properly set and a pushboard is used, there is less chance of direct physical contact with the blade whilst ripping on a radial arm saw as compared to the table saw. Additionally, if the board were to move out away from the fence and contact the rear of the blade, it cannot be launched into the air nor draw your hand into the blade like it could on a table saw. However, a kickback where the board is ejected straight back along the fence remains a possibility, especially if the anti-kickback pawl is not properly used. Overall, I would argue the radial arm saw can be as safe or safer than a table saw. Do I think you can accurately and safely rip on a radial arm saw? If you own a quality cast iron saw that has been set up properly, use an appropriate blade, and operate it correctly, absolutely. However, would I recommend others to use a radial arm saw for ripping? In general, probably not, only because I know there will be a significant number of people who will not take the time to set up their saw correctly, nor have the discipline necessary to use them safely. If I were recommending a saw to a new woodworker, I might suggest a table saw with AIM, or Active Injury Mitigation Technology. It's hard to argue against the incredible safety features these modern versions provide. With that said, I prefer ripping on my radial arm saws. I appreciate their small footprint in my shop, and I will continue to use them as my primary saws. It's a personal decision only you can make for yourself. I hope you found this video informative. Please leave me a comment and let me know what you think. Be safe, and thanks for watching.